Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of Secrecy, Return of the Mystery Cults. How does one decide the perfect secret? How does one become an architect of ciphers? And can it resurrect the atmospheres of the mystery cults? In this seminar, we will explore those code worlds of secrecy and techniques of encryption through which disguised, covert, subterranean, and cloaked zones are generated. Imperative, conspiracy. Students will bring their own original selections of secret societies, undergrounds, outsider movements, or unseen circles each week in a laboratory mode experimental discussion. Each week will follow a specific prompt to be shared in advance. The instructor for the seminar, Jason Mohaghegh, is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Babson College. His scholarly work is focused upon tracking currents of experimental thought between the Middle East and the West, with particular attention to exploring the concepts of chaos, violence, illusion, silence, madness, futurism, disappearance, and apocalyptic aesthetics. He has published several books to date, including The Chaotic Imagination, New Literature, and Philosophy of the Middle East, Inflictions, The Writing of Violence in the Middle East, The Radical Unspoken, Silence in the Middle Eastern and Western Thought, Insurgent, Poet, Mystic, Sectarian, The Four Masks of an Eastern Postmodernism, Elemental Disappearances, Omnicide, Mania, Fatality, and the Future in Delirium, and Night, A Philosophy of the After Dark. He's also the co-editor of the Suspensions book series with Bloomsbury Press and the co-director of the Fifth Disappearance Lab. Take it away, Jason.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see all of you. I want to start sort of with something slightly sentimental, even though we're going to some twisted chambers of thought. Everyone has origin stories in these games that we're playing: philosophical, mystical, literary, poetic. You know, we all get started by some white rabbit. And my elder, who initiated me into these worlds that we're discussing, was my grandfather. Some of you may know that, who've heard me speak before, at a very young age. And it wasn't just through his voice, his intonations, the images that he showed me, the poetry he introduced me to. It was actually through a particular artifact, which was this book. And this is a collection of the poetry of the Persian poet Hafez, right, who was a poet of sort of inspirations and night visions and wine songs. And I'll mention him in a minute further. But this, when my grandfather died many years ago, the only thing that I wanted from his room, from his home, was this book, because it was his most precious and treasured item. It was a portal into solitude, into imagination, into all kinds of things. But it also was a book that is now banned and forbidden in the current, the iconography that's in this one, because there are images that are not allowed. So that got me interested at a very young age in lost books. And that could mean stolen books, it can mean banned books, it can mean books that were left unfinished or never written, illegible books, books that were shelved in basements for later generations. That happens in a lot of totalitarian societies, where authors will write something and just leave it, sort of discard it until another generation can excavate it. You know, the books missing in time. And this became fascinating to me because it's not simply a dialectic of lost and found. It's actually lost and unlost books. And there's a slight difference there that we'll talk about. Because when we talk about resurrecting the mystery cults in 2024, at the threshold of an age of virtuality and simulations and metaverses and artificial intelligence, it's not just finding them, it's really making something unlost. And that has a very peculiar and dangerous gamble associated with it. So let's realize this, first of all. When you go in search of lost books, you're chasing rumors, just like when you're looking for secret societies. And I've spent decades chasing secret societies as well, to be honest with you. It's one of my side interests, and come across a lot of sects and a lot of people who are involved in sects. Sometimes they're more fantastical than you ever could have imagined, more bizarre. Sometimes they're utterly disenchanting when you get to the bottom of what they represent. But either way, it's more the method and the chase that's intriguing about them, because the first step is that you have to be tracking rumors, whispers, hearsay, sort of allusions to things. People never catch a full glance. They're not institutionalized in ways that you can map them geographically or even in time. So the first encounter with a secret society is often through a liar. I'll say that. And by not a pure liar, someone who is in the inner circles of a society who switches details. Right? So a famous example of this is there's a Armenian mystic, Georgian Armenian mystic, George Gurdjieff. Some of you may have heard of him. And he used to, the film The Master is partially based on his persona, if you've ever seen it, with Joaquin Phoenix and Philip Seymour Hoffman. But Gurdjieff was an entertainment piece at a lot of aristocratic parties in Europe and New York City, where super elites used to invite him to hypnotize their guests and give them visions of their past lives. Right? And he did well with this. He made a lot of money doing this. And when he was asked where he developed his techniques, he said that he developed it from a secret society called the Sarmung Brotherhood in Iran during his travels to the Persian frontiers. Well, it took me years of trying to uncover a Sarmung Brotherhood. I know Sufi mystics, I know intellectuals, I know artists in the undergrounds in Iran, and no one's ever heard of the Sarmung Brotherhood. Right? And these are people, and Reza doesn't know it either. Reza Negarestani doesn't know the Sarmung Brotherhood is. So if Reza doesn't know it, and all my other contacts, the leads were exhausted until I realized something. He didn't lie. He had found a secret society, he had found a mystical order. It just wasn't called the Sarmung Brotherhood, and it wasn't located where he said it was. So you have to sort of just see that they swap details, they embellish sort of, or distort sort of trivial dimensions of it in order to make it more elusive. So that's the first thing. The second way you can get exposed is you look for a traitor. You look for someone who has either been outcast or who has defected and abandoned the secret society, and who will want to reveal details to expose them in certain ways. The problem with that interlocutor is that they have a vendetta, and their extreme resentment makes them prone to exaggeration or to biases of certain kinds, which are fine. They create a notoriety and an infamy around it. Now, this third way, the only third way that you can be exposed to a secret society is as an initiate. So that's when they find you while you're trying to find them. And if they decide that you're worthwhile based on whatever criterion, and that's another interesting thing we're going to talk about in this seminar, what's the criterion by which you are chosen? And that can be vastly different, from things as strangely superficial as appearance to things as profound and esoteric as being able to unlock codes or read riddles or pass tests, right, of certain kind. We'll get into all of that. But it all starts, again, for me in this seminar with, and there's going to be a time when I'm going to, today even, hand the reins over to all of you, and we're going to start creatively trying to orchestrate a secret society. Meaning we're going to try and actually hypothetically devise one. We're going to see how the engineering of it is very complex and very intricate in the decision-making, like many rituals are. But let's start back with Hafez. So something that a lot of people, at least on the Iranian side, knows that Hafez had a title. He was called the Lisan al-Ghaib, which means tongue of the hidden. It's a great title. Somewhat tragically, it was appropriated by the film Dune, and then coded in all kinds of messianic and imperialist and counter-imperialist messaging, which it doesn't have anything to do with. Lisan al-Ghaib, the tongue of the hidden, is not, to my research and knowledge, a sacred sort of element at all. It's a technique. what does it mean to get a title like Tongue of the Hidden? It simply means that Hafez didn't see things for what they were. He saw how things could turn. And so philosophy of the turn, I often go to that, is really important. The alchemists were based on this. What's the distortion potential that's in the molecules of any phenomenon? And criminals think like this. Criminals will meet Katerina or Sayed, and the first thing they'll think is, how do I turn them? That's the very essence of manipulation, which is to turn you against your essence in a certain way, right? So to tilt you, to lean you, to orient you, to position you. By the way, the Socratic method is nothing less than this. If you want to put that as one of the origin points of philosophy, philosophy begins with a strange schizophrenic in the marketplace, trying to guide you through a labyrinth, through provocations and questions, right? That's exactly it, trying to distort your perception and sort of make you arrive at a certain point of thought. So all of Hafez's poetics, by the way, and you can read him, he's an amazing figure of attraction, confusion, sorrow. They're actually secret gauges or sensors that measure how entities become other than what they're supposed to be, right? And he actually even does this. He shows you this. He's got, deconstructionists would have loved him, not that I want them to, but he has a linguistic game called iham, which is, this is really cool, where a word has double meanings, meaning a word can mean two things. That sounds fine. We call those double entendres and all that. But the way he does it is there's always one meaning that is immediate to your mind and one meaning that is distantly sort of marginalized from your mind. So you're not thinking about it. And his trick is to see whether he can make enough clues and somewhat imperceptibly reverse the order, so that you start to read that word in his poem in terms of its second meaning, the one that you're less instinctually attuned to, right? It's a great, great manipulative practice. So I want to share a screen and go through a series of code sequences with you that hopefully will be interesting. And trust me, these all are linked to a method of how we're going to start constructing and excavating secret societies. So we talked about Hafez, the turn, the tongue of the hidden. He also, by the way, it's not incidental that he referred to the world or reality as the wheel, right? And his games of double meaning. Now, nearly 800 years later in 2016, the image that you're seeing is from a visual artist in Iran named Nushin Shafi, a woman visual artist. And this is exactly halfway when she creates this between two high-profile protest movements you're probably aware of, where millions of Iranian youth spilled into the streets. And her image is what interested me is, one, the title of these photographs that she has. First, they're called Daj, which is an ancient Persian word for night's darkness. Right? You'll only find this type of phenomenological language in old world languages. So in Arabic, for instance, you'll find words like moon's halo or the glittering of a mirage, a word that means not mirage, they have a word for mirage, but the glittering of the mirage. So here you have the darkness of the night, night's darkness. And what she did, and it's a very simple and modest sort of project, but what she did was she just inhabited at twilight the city kind of in this nightfall state in neighborhoods that were vacated. And she started looking for object worlds, clotheslines, frayed curtains, oval-shaped structures that were seemingly random, but then started to look diabolical in the right light. And what she claimed was, and this is the part that links her to Hafez, she was interested in pursuing a special visual lexicon, a vocabulary that resided in the nocturnal hours when no one else is looking. That's what she claims. So that's the legacy of the lisan al-ghaib, the tongue of the hidden again, right? Now, where do I want to take you then? And that's another one of her images. Let's start our codes. What you're looking at here is an ancient tablet with words of ominous doomsday resonance. This used to sit beneath glass in the Museum of Constantinople for several centuries, right? It's a Mesopotamian clay tablet that reads, as you can see, "Our earth is degenerate in these latter days. There are signs that the world is speedily coming to an end. Bribery and corruption are common. Children no longer obey their parents. Everyone wants to write a book, and the end of the world is evidently approaching. Okay. What are the turns? You see the numericals down here? These are all turns. Problem number one. We have to ask ourselves what it means that the very first civilization already dreamt of the world's end. Right? So why the earliest peoples, forming the original cities of the earth, would find themselves compelled to try and unlock the language of the last breath. That's weird. Why an ancient Babylonian or Mesopotamian society would already have dreams of apocalypse. Two, the tablet's caption is anonymous. And I love anonymous genres. Revolutionary manifestos can be anonymous, but actually a lot of subgenres of subcultures, gossip, rumors, jokes. Also, we don't know the authors. The authors are kind of murky or disbanded. So these are writings that kind of persist like an ulterior motive. It's just written by someone, written somewhere. Third turn. This tablet was allegedly viewed by several major professors of philosophy and Orientalist scholars in the early 1900s. They all recounted its engraved words in their notebooks, only for the stone to vanish after the 1920s. It's never been found again. Right? The Oman's sayings are still reproduced in different journals in different places, but they can't find the original source. They don't know where it's been. So it's a misplaced artifact. But here's my favorite turn and twist of this. Almost all those eyewitness records disagree on the content of the tablet. Some say that it's from 5000 BCE, others 3800, others 2800, others 2694. So they can't agree on the dates. These are supposed Orientalist scholars who are all about precision and documentation. Secondly, they disagree on the last lines. So similar, this happens in the Gospels, by the way, in the New Testament as well. You know, Father, why have you forsaken me? It is accomplished. These are the last lines of Christ on the cross. Only 2 of the Gospels have him saying that. The other 2 sort of erase them or add other things. So this too, everyone wants to write a book, appears in only some of the transcriptions, and it's very interesting as to why this is the case. Now, fast forward thousands of years later, in the same regional vicinity as the Babylonian tablet, and now you find yourself up against the Prophet Muhammad. Now, the Prophet Muhammad of Islam is said to have spent prolonged intervals in a cave called the Hill of Illumination, Jabal al-Nur, where angelic voices, particularly the voice of Gabriel, would transmit scattered verses of the Quran to him. Remember, the Prophet is illiterate, right? That's a cool paradox that's at the heart of Islamic storytelling. Now, after every awesome encounter, he'd be terrified, he'd be trembling. The Prophet would supposedly descend from the cave in a state of euphoric stammering. He'd be talking in tongues, he'd be gasping, and he'd be making these trance-like sounds. These sounds were documented at the time by listeners, and they're called the mystery letters, the muqatta'at. Now, the mystery letters, you will see them in 29 of the verses of the Quran. They're just 3 letters hanging at the top. Alif, Lam, Mim, A-L-M. What do they mean? Nobody knows. They don't form words, they don't form articulations, they're at the borders between sense and nonsense. But presumably, they're the phenomenological chronicle of the spurting tongue of the Prophet himself in a state of daze. So he comes down from the mountain and he's saying, he's stuttering like that. And they write A-L-M, thinking this might have some value later. We better record these sounds. So it's pure sound. It's not meaning, right? And it's 1 to 5 inceptive letters sort of that form these enigmatic shattered openings. If you ask a standard Islamic clergy what those letters are, they tell you to ignore them because they're dangerous. They say that they're perilous and fatal to try and tempt the mystery letters. Better to just move through them. Well, of course, who does that entice? Sufi mystics. Sufi mystics want to do everything wrong, everything forbidden. And so what they tell you is the rest of the Quranic messaging is irrelevant. Your real job is to figure out those mystery letters. All of the content of the divine, that's the divine tongue itself. So if you can decode that, these are hackers and coders sort of in the medieval sense of the word. They want to sort of get into it. So interesting thing before we start with this. So we're on the Hill of Illumination. We're in the Prophet's cave. The Prophet Muhammad's profession is not incidental. He's a trader, not traitor, trader. He's a merchant. He sells things. He's a figure of transition, exchange. He changes hands, objects between hands. So he's a figure of interception. That makes him a good messenger. You follow? That makes him a good go-between, a carrier, a vessel, an intermediary, right? So just remembering that interesting element of him. By the onset of the 8th century, though, so about 200 years later, Muslim sages will fashion a game called the Abjad alphanumerical grid. By the way, Reza Negarestani has written on this in Collapse decades ago, okay? The Abjad is, anybody who's from these places knows it. It's nothing so sort of dark or sinister or anything like that. It's kind of like the counting pebbles that the Greeks had and things like that. It's a form of multiplicative tables whereby basically Abjad means A, B, J, D, the first 4 letters of the Aramaic alphabet. They're given numerical values and you can do all kinds of numerologies with them. Now, where it gets interesting and what I love about it is not that I believe in numerologies necessarily. Belief is irrelevant to me. It's more just the intriguing dimensions and possibilities of it and the experiential aspect. Is that who's in control of the Abjad tables typically in Muslim world cultures? Old women, elder women. They sew these sequences as wishes or as curses into silk cloth, or they write them across small pieces of folded paper, or they inscribe them in indigo ink on animal skins. Right? So there's a whole performativity and ceremony sort of surrounding these, and they're based on the mystery letters again, right? And what I love about it is because in places that are ruled by theology, superstition is an amazing form of resistance, right? It's because it's not about belief so much as it is about the material, the abstraction of belief, the transcendent belief. Instead, you get talismans, charms, sort of movements, which places things back in the realm of materiality in a really interesting way. Now, around 1370, there's a Sufi mystic named Fazlullah Astarawadi. You don't need to know his name, but he forms a sect, a secret society called Hurufism. And what he claims is that these mystery letters that the Prophet were speaking are actually, now this is where it gets really cool, they're consonants and vowels, if you know how to arrange them, have incarnationist potentials. What does that mean? It can infuse divinity into things. God can come alive into things if you know how to release the letters the right way. But even cooler for me than incarnation principles is that he claims that if you know how to decipher these mystery letters, you can read the dreams of God. Now, I could waste a whole 10 years writing a book on what the dreams of a God might be. That's such a cool topic. It's such a great premise, right? What does a God dream? What are the dreams of God? Freud didn't even dare go that far, right? Into sort of the divine unconscious and all of that. So yeah, he writes that in a book called the Javdannameh Kabir, Great Book of Eternity, and he talks about this. By the way, he was the favored sage of one of the kings of Persia for decades, who believed in his Hurufist secret society, and then a new dynasty took over. They gave him one chance to sell them on it, and then they killed him. They beheaded him when the new king did not find it as compelling an idea. In 1857, there's a figure named Baha'u'llah. That's the founder of the Baha'i faith, some of you may know, which is a sect of Islam in the 19th century, often very persecuted and controversial. And he writes a book called The Commentary on the Isolated Letters. It also has a subtitle, It's cool. This is part of the genre of secret societies. They often go by many names. So you have books that they write that also have multiple titles. So it's also called the Tablet of the Light Verse. And that quote that you see at the top of this page is from that. A black teardrop fell from the primordial pen onto the snow white tablet by which the point was created. The point turned into an aleph. So his description is that there's a primordial pen, it oozes black ink, and those became the mystery letters, right? But what's really interesting is that this figure Baha'u'llah then devises all these anagrams based on the mystery letters. He becomes one of the first figures in history really to experiment with anagrams. You'll read great schizophrenics like Una Kazern in the 20th century, she'll become a queen of anagrams, and all the kind of hallucinatory potentials that are in anagrams and all the kind of paranoia that you can infuse into it or obsession. But he's doing that with the mystery letters. And he spells the entire mystery letters to form a sentence all throughout the Quran. They're dispersed in 29 verses again. He takes the 3 or 5 in each one, and he comes up with an anagram that spells a wise text has a secret. And this is one of the bases of his secret society. He was accused of blasphemy, false impersonation of a prophet, and he was imprisoned underground within the infamous, what we call in Persian, siyah chal, which is a black pit. It's a black dungeon, pitch black darkness, and then exiled and many of his followers slaughtered. Now, who finds these mystery letters absolutely fascinating in the 20th century? Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, right? He has a short story, if you've never read it, called the Aleph, the A, right, which is the first mystery letter, and he describes it as a black pyramid and a broken labyrinth through which one can view every point in the universe from every conceivable angle simultaneously. Right? So it's a really amazing perceptual prism that he sees in this. And finally, turn number 7. So that's 1949 in Buenos Aires. Borges becomes infatuated with the mystery letters. In 1857, Baha'u'llah writes his stuff and forms a secret society. Now it's 1974 in Egypt, and a biochemist named Rashad Khalifa starts telling that he has uncovered an unadulterated mathematical formula called the Quran code, or code 19, behind the mystery letters. Okay? He's a biochemist. He knows mathematics extremely well. He studies the frequency and repetitive patterns, and he finds that they all uniformly gravitate towards the number 19. So he calls it code 19, or the Quran code. Now ready for this, 1974, his resulting conclusion is that God is an algorithmic being of hypercomputational sentience, what in 2024 we might call artificial intelligence. This is an amazing breakthrough, a visionary moment. I mean, it's insane, but it's kind of awesome. He forms his own mosque based on this, and he got stabbed to death 29 times, and his body was drenched in flammable liquids when they found him. Okay, so that's how this ends, this code ends. Now, within 100 years of the Prophet's death, so I just want you to see all the turns and twists, because what connects an Argentinian modernist writer like Borges in his library, in the capital city, with, an imposter prophet, to a biochemist working on a mathematical formula? They're not dominant threads of causality here. These are highly incidental, highly delicate, highly circumstantial forms of twisting that lead from one to the other, but they nevertheless form bridges. So within 100 years, and some of you have heard me talk about this, of the Prophet's death, here's another dimension I want to get into. There's an account that gains popularity that he supposedly claimed, not in the Quran, but in his own sayings. The Prophet supposedly said that God has 99 names. Now, this unleashes a Pandora's box in the history of Islamic culture based on a single sentence. And the reason I bring that up is because that's one of the great things about secret societies. Very minimal and subtle articulations can have whirlwind effects, right? So that's, by the way, the opposite of propaganda, which is why I like going into secret societies, because I think they're counter-ideological, right? Even though there are authoritarian dimensions, even though there are flagrant brainwashing techniques that can happen in cults, right? So that occur. Nevertheless, I see them as counter-ideological for these reasons. So supposedly someone said that the Prophet Muhammad said, God has 99 names, 100 less one, and he who memorized them all by heart will enter paradise. Okay? So it's a way to a winning ticket. And what I like about this is that it has nothing to do with morality. You don't get into paradise. This is a loophole. This is a side angle. You know, if you can just master a technique and learn the 99 names and say them correctly, memorize them correctly, you can enter paradise. There's no statement of ethical or moral virtue here. But then you get this grand mission, and I won't go into how this actually ties into what a great Soviet thinker, Mikhail Bakhtin, called polyglossia and heteroglossia, which is diverse perspectives and voices. What's interesting about this that starts to happen is that when you say God has 99 names, okay, and that you start to see even in the image there that all of a sudden the sacred world becomes a crystal lattice, right? It's no longer unified. It's no longer about oneness. It's no longer about the one in a capital sense. Now you have all these fractals. So turn number one, as you see in the sentence, part of the mythology of the 99 names is a suspicion that the most accomplished memorizer, through some arcane type of rehearsal, could activate a direct dialogue with the Almighty. See, that's not what is said here, but they make a jump from the prophet's statement, the alleged prophet's statement, to the next idea, which is that anyone who can say the 99 names has the power of summoning God into an irresistible dialogue. God can't help but talk with you. Right? So there's power, right, to become the confidant of the omniscient. By the way, it's suggested that Moses had this power, because Moses is the one on the mountain who's able to call God, right? It's very interesting. If you look carefully, most of the other prophets are called by God, but Moses can call God into conversation, right? Now, the next thing, turn number two. The 99 names are essentially conceptual personae, to use a Deleuzian term. They're not metaphors, but they're avatars. That's a better way of looking at them. And to think of God in a video game era that we live in, to think of God as having 99 avatars is kind of interesting, right? Because it wrenches identity away from the tyranny of a proper noun. And instead, what we're dealing with are characters, pseudonyms, countersignatures, masks, alter egos, and aliases. So you can devise a whole philosophy of the incognito. And it's well known that in the mystery cults, by the way, no one goes by the original Eleusinian mystery cults in the Mediterranean. Nobody goes by their proper name. Nobody goes by their given name. And actually, the sign of your mastery is how many different titles you can accumulate over time, how many names you can be given, right? So, okay. And actually, this does happen with pagan gods as well. Go look at Viking gods like Odin, and he's got like 17 names, and all that. So this is an interesting dimension there. Now, the turn number three. Effectively, there are three registers of the 99 names. There are benevolent names, there are dark names, like destructive names, and there are neutral names. The neutral ones intrigue me the most. So benevolent names of God in Islam are like Al-Karim, the generous, Al-Hakim, the wise, Al-Majid, the magnificent, Al-Latif, the subtle, right? These are nice names. The forgiving, Al-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, that's what you hear in the first prayer of Islam, means the merciful, the compassionate, all of these things. And then you've got the nasty names, the dark names. Al-Hasib, the reckoner, Al-Ghabid, the constrictor, Al-Mushil, the humiliator, Al-Ghahar, the subduer, Al-Khafid, the degrader, right? And you can have Al-Muntaqim, that's the vengeful. He has lots of names like that. But the ones I like are the neutral ones. Al-Raghib, the watchful. Al-Muakhir, the delayer. Al-Zahir, the manifest. Al-Ba'ari, the evolver. Al-Waris, the inheritor. That's interesting. Like these are names that have more ambiguity. And what you start to realize is, I said in the last thing that they're avatars, but really they're moods. They're the moods of God. And God can flip between temperaments and volatile gestures depending on these moods. So now a master of this secret society would be able to figure out how to turn God's mood. And if you look very carefully in the Old Testament, not the New Testament, when God gets smoothed out into the sort of benevolent, transcendent grandfather figure. But if you look in the early, really ambivalent Old Testament, you'll notice prophets who can spark the envy or anger of God. And it's really interesting to trace the pivot, meaning what can induce a mood change in divinity, in divine consciousness. So according to this tradition, it's in the names. Now, by the early 1200s, there's an Andalusian theologian named Ibn Arabi, very interesting figure, Ibn Arabi. And he advances what's called his mirror theory of creation. Again, I love it that everybody's on YouTube listening to Elon Musk talk about whether we are actually living in a simulation or not. This guy, way back in the 1200s, said that we exist, and this is 10 times more philosophically intelligent than a simulation theory. He says that we exist in the khayalun fi khayal, imagination within imagination, the mirror of the mirror. Now, this is interesting because what that means is that being itself is nothing more than a row of countless dissolutions into the, quote, this is his term, apparent non-existence of the universal mirror. This means that we are chasing ourselves across countless mirror surfaces that are themselves forever cracking apart. He calls this term ring stones in the Arabic, by the way. He calls them the ring stones. Very cool idea. Now, he has a disciple, and this is why I'm teaching this, because you'll start to see just in these very concrete examples how entire mythologies form based on this. Ibn Arabi has a disciple named Haydar Amuli, who then goes a step further, and he says, no. These 99 names are also theogenetic, meaning God passes on qualities hereditarily into his creations through his names. Now this gets weird. Are you ready for this? Every angel is a carrier of one of the positive qualities of the divine. So those names that are the light names, the good names, which are most of the names are positive names. They're the carriers. Each one of them gets one attribute of the divine. That's the angels, the rank of angels. And then there's the shayateen, the evil angels, shaitan, Satan, the satanic angels. Each one of them have one quality infused into them from the dark or destructive names, whether it's vengeance or it's anger or it's whatever, or annihilation. So they're carrying one of those things. And this is just, it's a really interesting idea. I've said this before, there's a great mythology about the idea that all of the angels of God were created by sunlight, by God's sunlight, except Satan, who was created by moonlight. So what you get here is the exception or the anomaly that then changes everything. And also, again, if you start to notice, have you guys noticed that in superhero culture, which is a form of mythology, even in your Avengers and your X-Men, we have transitioned from all-encompassing heroic figures like Superman, who can do everything. He can fly, he can laser beam, he can do all sorts of stuff, that has superhuman strength, and he's only one, there's only one of him, to X-Men or Avengers, who each typically have one power, one highly specific power. This emanates from that tradition. It's a very interesting question of why we're going back to that paradigm of the otherworldly at this point in history, and of power at this point in history. So turn number 6 Of course, Sufis have to always throw a new curve and a complication. They're always innovating. So the mystics tell you that, by the way, the 99 names are just a prelude towards the discovery of the 100th name, the Al-Ism al-Azam, the ultimate name. And the person who can learn because the 99 names of God, all of you, by the way, can learn. So by the way, you might say, wait a minute, shouldn't I get into paradise if I can just memorize the 99 names? They're there right on the page. You see them. No, it's not about memorization in terms of text. It's about recitation. You have to be able to know how to speak them correctly with the correct intonations. And that supposedly involves all kinds of soul mechanisms as well. But this is really cool. The 100th name idea, it's not so you say, well, what do you get if you learn the 100th name of God? You can force God to grant wishes. So now God becomes almost like a genie apparatus, sort of rubbing the lamp. God cannot say no to granting you your wishes, which is interesting because at some level, that's typically the domain of the devil. The devil is a wish granter in monotheistic theologies. But here, God has to do your bidding. All right. Now, go about 100 years after the prophet again, or around 900, the year 900, a couple of hundred years after the prophet. And there's a figure who I wish you all knew more, Hallaj. He's an absolutely stunning early Sufi figure, one of the most iconic and iconoclastic mystics of all time. He's an unparalleled thinker of annihilation. By the way, I don't think there would be George Bataille and figures like that who think about annihilation without Hallaj. I think he's the pioneer, really, of that philosophy. And for those who don't know, he was killed for declaring that he was God. He famously said, "Ana al-Haq, I am God," and he was murdered for it. So he's a pronouncer of impossible statements, impossible utterances, and he takes it to their lethal extreme. So what are the things that we need to know about him from number 2? What are the twists and turns about his biography? If you were all in the year, sort of in the 9th century in Baghdad, and you're watching this mystic being strung up on a cross, amputated, burned alive, and he's crying in ecstasy still, "I am God," while chained up there, you might want to know how he got to that point. What's his backstory? I'll tell you a few things, and this is interesting for how secret societies get formed. Hallaj also, by the way, was famous for starting sects in every city and abandoning them in the desert. He would take them into the desert to sleep, and then he would leave in the middle of the night. So it's one interesting thing. But the first thing that I want to note is that Hallaj is a Sufi before the term Sufism exists. And I love this fact because before it becomes a seal of official orders in a certain history and tradition, he's the progenitor. He's the first wave of something that's just a rogue force without any title or description. And there's a great other parallel mystic to him, Sohrawardi, who famously once said, "When there was no name for it, there was Sufism. When they called it Sufism, it ceased to exist." It's an important statement. Other thing about him is that Hallaj is weird in the fact that he was known in his young years to jump from master to master. He joined like 28 different sects, mystical sects, in his time. He would exhaust them, learn everything he could, and then leave them. So he was called a traitor, a lunatic, a transient by others. They despised him because he would learn secrets and then abandon the masters and go to another master and turn elsewhere. He was also said to be a miracle worker. And you see this with figures like Rasputin, with Nostradamus, with all kinds of monk-like figures who have these strange histories associated with them. He was said that he stood for an entire year in a courtyard without moving or eating. They said that he could light or extinguish candles from afar. He used to dine with lepers unharmed, but that's also a Christ power as well. And my favorite one is that he could augment or shrink his own shadow across the walls. So people gave these eyewitness accounts that they were terrified when all of a sudden Hallaj's shadow would swell against the lantern light while they were talking with him and become monstrous. Another interesting thing about him, he wrote only one book in his lifetime. So like Socrates, he didn't write things down. He just speaks in different places, but he does have a book, and it's not really a book. It's an essay. It's very short. It's called the Tawasin. I have an image of it for you there, and you see the quote. He says, "A lamp appeared from the light of the unseen. It appeared and returned, and it surpassed the other lamps. It was a ruling moon, manifesting itself radiantly among the other moons." The brilliance of this philosophy that there's a hierarchy of moons, and one moon that rules over the other moons. This is a whole cosmological sort of sequence that he begins, which has unbelievable stuff. But what's the connection to everything we've been talking about? This book is called the Tawasin. That's incorrectly transliterated by whoever did that diagram. Tawasin. TVS. 3 mystery letters from a particular chapter of the Quran is the name of his book. Do you know what that chapter is about? The nature of the devil. That chapter in the Quran is about, so he takes the 3 mystery letters about the chapter on evil in the Quran, and he makes it the title of his own mystical book, which is full of diagrams that you see in geometries, and it's all about the unlooked for world, right, that he's looking for. Now, interesting historical dimension. His trial and his martyrdom were allegedly witnessed by thousands of people, huge crowd, and yet everybody, the accounts differ wildly about the mode of execution. I have read hundreds almost of eyewitness accounts. Some say that he was whipped. They all say he was crucified, right? But some say he was whipped viciously, others that he was beaten with clubs, others that his legs and arms were amputated, others that he was decapitated, stoned by the crowd, his eyes plucked out, left to bleed to death, and still others maintain that he was set on fire, all the while laughing in ecstasy. Again, I don't care at all about the historical validity of any of the claims. I'm interested in the deviation. What allows for this wild discrepancy and deviation? By the way, this does not even happen with figures like Joan of Arc, who's a fascinating figure. All the accounts of all the priests who were there chronicling it say the same thing. You know, very little sort of differentials in her trial document or in her execution. What did Hallaj do that he created these optical illusions among people that they swear that they saw all these things, or this temptation for themselves to improvise an event, to go home and immediately lie about what they saw? And it's not that they wanted to lie out of malicious reasons. It's that what they saw was so unthinkable that they felt they desperately tried to enhance the story in some way by adding dimensions and adding sort of elements of it. James, did you want to say something?
It's wonderful that you're covering Hallaj. I think a mass hysteria story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's inspiring hysterics. I think there's
Absolutely.
another one of my favorites is one of the Sufis, which, you know, asked another Sufi, well, if Hallaj was so beloved of God, didn't God warn him what would happen? And the other Sufi says something like, yeah, but Hallaj did it anyway.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because you even have a parallel with the Garden of Gethsemane in Christianity, where Christ is crying sort of the night before the crucifixion. And it's controversial as to whether he's pleading to be let off the hook of his messianic destiny, you know, pleading for an exemption, whereas Hallaj just marches straight into the event. Yes, it is mass hysteria, and there's something that's interesting in the storytelling mechanism of why people saw so many different things as opposed to the shared hallucination that often takes place in mass hysteria. It's something we'll get into. Surush, did you want to say something quickly?
Yeah, first of all, it's all fascinating, and at the same time, I guess this same diagram appears in the book on that wall shouting at the earth, which is like a explanation of what the concept of shat, I guess, is very fundamental. One of those concepts we're thinking about all the time. And then the thing about the book is, first one is about, as you know, the concept of talking. At the same time, what makes it way more complicated than what actually was said by Allah or something like that. Like this is the detail of the mystery. And then at the same time, trying to explain it. So this paradox is very fascinating, I guess. And then also the Hierophantēs and Mohaghegh always, I guess, come back to this very maybe diagram, the letters and things like that. And I would love you to talk about that. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. No, excellent. This is great. This is actually going to get us into something too. I mean, there are many things from what you just said. One of them is that when you have books that are attributed to multiple authors, and we're going to get into that eventually as well, that there's going to be overlaps. There's going to be one particular book which throughout history was said to be written by someone, and now it's discovered that it was written by someone else. You know, even Shakespeare, there are conspiracy theories about who wrote it. You know, is Shakespeare real and all that? And it adds, again, beyond the historical facticity of it, it adds layers of possibility, you know, of conspiracy, where then you can, I mean, even there's a film that Jim Jarmusch made, what was it called? Only Lovers Left Alive, about vampires, right? And I think like Lord Byron and maybe Shakespeare and all these famous writers, that it was this vampire who he just keeps on living and he becomes different famous writers. And I think one of them is like every famous musician, like Bach and then Mozart. He just keeps resurrecting himself as a different musical personality or something through sort of over time. So it's just, yeah, this unlocks amazing things. One thing that just that also I wanted to say based on this is, it doesn't stop just with the figure. That's the great power of the secret society or of the sect. After Hallaj's martyrdom, after his divergent eyewitnessings, this starts to become like an infectious epidemic for all Sufi executions. So Ain al-Ghazat al-Hamadani, thousands of people claim that after he was beheaded, he picked up his head and ran with it. He ran away with his own head. Other ones claim that, you know, that they started speaking after they flatlined, so they would be mouthing statements after their death. Others caused natural disasters or turbulent winds to blow. By the way, many of you may or may not know, a subtle detail in the Christian lore is that when Christ dies, his last breath, he causes a kind of earthquake, chasm in the ground to open up. So these are reports that that in a discourse of disenchantment, all of a sudden you get this sort of brutal re-enchantment that can take place. Now, real quick, I just want to go through a couple of others here, and then I want to open it to discussion. So now you're 13th century, you're moving on from Hallaj, and now the dead bodies of these mystics have to be hidden and buried in irregular off-map locations, because the kings and caliphs and sultans who execute them don't want to give them proper burial rights. So now you get these far-flung shrines and mausoleums, often around coastlines. Why coastlines? Because you have to move them if they get discovered. Why do you have to move them? Why do they get discovered? Because people turn them into shrines. If you find out where Hallaj is buried, everyone wants to go and touch the garments of Hallaj or get close to the body of Hallaj, so you have to move him. So this happened over time. But then something else started happening, and it's ongoing to this day. And there's a great visual artist, Muad Musbahi. He's also he's a visual artist and an anthropologist, works around North Africa. He started noticing that a lot of these burial shrines of the mystics are becoming unsettled by climate change, and they're sinking into the sea. So gradually the rocks are eroding, and now what you're getting are mystical bodies in their tombs being drifted sort of out into the middle of the sea. And this is very interesting because, well, I mean, aesthetically, you get this immersion and undulation of sort of tombs among waves being pulled under into the below, which is a very interesting thing. But it also, when I listened to Muad Musbahi talk about this in 2020 and talk about his project, and I had known about this happening, by the way, but he did a wonderful job describing it. But it brought me back to, again, the figure Ibn Arabi, who I mentioned earlier, this metaphysician, who tells a counter version of the story of Noah's flood, which is fascinating. He says everybody gets it wrong. They think that the ones who survived the plague were God's most dedicated or chosen ones. But it's not true. And he thinks, and in the story, according to the Old Testament, Noah goes around telling everybody that the flood is coming, you better start preparing, you better build an ark like I'm doing, or God's going to flood the world. And they didn't believe, they were cynical and all of that, and so they were punished. And he says, this is absolutely incorrect. Noah's invitation to survival is a false test, Ibn Arabi says. He says, they actually passed it by remaining unrescued on the land and subordinating themselves to the blue-green terror of the deity. You see, what he says is that the truly devoted were the ones who wanted nothing more than the chance to drown in their God. Right? And so they let the waters overtake them. That's a very interesting idea then, right? Because the way he even describes it, he has these beautiful images of their calm stares as gradually the level of the water starts to go up and invade their orifices, their eyes, their ears, their mouths, their nostrils. And he says, you just see this calm bliss of the person who's being swept from the face of things, but is drowning in their God. And isn't there anything better? Is there anything better than that, he claims? This is a very interesting notion. But what I love most about this imagery here and the societies that formed around these shrines is that they really are about relic culture. And relic culture, for those who know, this exists in almost all religions. Comes from the ancient world, before even what we call paganism. It's in Egypt, it's in Mesopotamia, it's in Sumer and Babylon. The idea that there are certain things that if you just touch them, right, that they give you a sort of immediate power, right? So these are, in the terms of the saints, they could be a cane, it can be a scepter. This is also in Tibetan Buddhism, where the mirror of the elder, if you touch it, it gives blessings, or it gives healing, or it gives all kinds of possibilities, or it opens forms of knowledge. So this is garments, jewelry, old blades of saintly figures, whatever their personal heirlooms, that through mere contact, you can kiss it, you can touch it, you can place it against yourself, you can wear it. You get some turn of fortune. And if we're interested in turns, philosophy of turns, this is about turning your fortune, right? It's not about unlocking absolute truth. That's not what you get from a saint's garment. You get a turn of fortune, right? You get a good life as a result of that. So this is something interesting also, because if you think of Islam and Judaism and Christianity as part of this game of distantiation of God to the outermost, most impossible, untouchable spatial orientation, that with the exception of Christianity, where God kind of for a while inhabits a human flesh, but God is the bodiless one, the faceless one, the immaterial, the unseen. Now all of a sudden you're restoring sacred power to the level of touch, to contact. And what happens when you can touch upon the divine is an interesting idea, right? And again, I'm not interested in whether or not actually touching a saint's old razor blade or something that they used to shave with will give you major powers. I'm interested in what happens psychosomatically for the person who believes that, right? And who walks away thinking that they are stronger than they were before, or that they have better luck than they did yesterday, right? Because then you're in the domain of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And at the heart of the logic of every secret society is not prophecy, but self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So we've got to go back to that. Now, there's a lot more to tell you about fake deaths and all sorts of things. Last one, I'll just teach you this one really quickly. This is a figure who sort of makes me sad in some ways. There's a figure named Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. This is, by the way, this is one of these incidental things. There is no reason on earth why a barely known Islamic scholar from the medieval period, from the 1400s, who wrote an obscure book on plague, should have that book published by Penguin. I have no idea who made that editorial choice, who curated that book into their collection. Even in the Middle East, the so-called Middle East, this book is a barely ever read, thing. It's not a classic at all. This is not, Dante's Inferno, but it's amazing for a number of reasons. So you can read here on the right, you can see this is an excerpt. And this is a book on the plague, the bubonic plague that overtook Europe and a lot of the world. The death struck to the south in Al-Gharafa until around 3,000 had died. Those who carried the dead, washed them, and prepared graves became so scarce that they dug one large pit and cast the corpses into it. Many death shrouds were stolen. Stray dogs dug up bodies and ate the corpses' limbs. The caskets arrived in such numbers that I saw them lined up all the way from Al-Mu'minah prayer hall to the Al-Gharafa gate. They were like white vultures circling carrion. In the streets, it was as if the parade of caskets were a long string of camels tied by the tail, one following the other. Okay, how do you become somebody who in 1420 writes a book on the plague and literally goes around recording the last words of people infected by the plague, but also their physical symptomatologies, the rotting of skin, the hacking of lungs, with exceptional detail? Who is Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani? Well, he's one of the most prominent classical Islamic scholars of his time. So he's legit. He's like an academic figure, right? Revered. But what's his backstory before that? Orphan, an orphan whose uncle did not want to take care of him. So he dropped him off at a religious school to be taken care of, where they discovered that he's a genius. Particularly, he's a prodigy in terms of his memorization abilities. He memorized the entire Quran by age 9. And that was such a bizarre task of accomplishment that all of a sudden there were all these murmurs and whispers that he had done something unnatural to be able to have this skill set. And the claim was that he had swallowed water from a miracle well. So there's a well called the Zamzam, the well of Zamzam, which the Prophet had blessed near Mecca. And supposedly that created this supernatural retention talent of his memory, because he swallowed the water when you're not supposed to swallow the water necessarily, right? Anyway, so first interesting thing is, in secret societies, what is the role of the prodigy? There are initiates, but there are also prodigies. And that's a different ranking, right? And the excellence of an accelerated reader like him. So here's another interesting thing. He later married an extremely renowned woman scholar of the period. Yes, there were great women scholars in the Islamic era, and he was appointed a chief judge. So everything's going well. He's a dominant mind of the time. He writes lots of texts on Islamic, Islamic thought. His wife is a famous scholar. And then he decides to write a book on plague and medieval epidemics and wrestle with, by the way, what's interesting in this book is that it is arguably, for me, the first book that I've seen that actually attempts a philosophy of catastrophe. Because he has to, as an Islamic scholar, he has to figure out why God would do this, right? Why God would kill all these people, just slaughter, outright slaughter across a continent. It's not that it's the first time that catastrophes are depicted in literature, or texts. Of course, we have the Gilgamesh, we have, Homer writes about floods and earthquakes and all that. But it's the first time someone actually tries to create a philosophical outlook on the catastrophic. And there's a reason. So turn number one is that his 3 children were killed by the plague. He had 3 daughters. So this is why he decides to write this book. But then that's even weird. And one of the 3 daughters was pregnant at the time. So this phenomenon, this sickness, stole his entire bloodline, right? Robbed it from him. And that makes him, now, what would normally people do if we summon Dr. Freud and we say, in the face of an extreme traumatic event that kills your 3 children and your unborn grandchild, which means destroys your future, right? What would you typically do? And Freud would say, in the face of trauma like that, you repress. Well, this guy writes a 900-page compendium. That's not repression. That's not trauma in the typical, prototypical sense. So instead, he gets infused with this almost unfathomable commitment to tracking and sort of composing passages about this indisputable thing, this force that took everything from him. Now, this is where it gets in, because I've read this book closely, and the scary thing about it is that more and more, the more and more he writes, the more cold his writing becomes. And cold to the point of almost becoming plague-like itself. You've got this icy portfolio of impact, syndromes, effects. It chills the spine to read it. That's why I gave you a passage there. It's written like a grocery list. It's written metallically, mechanistically, right? And there's no mourning, there's no sentiment, there's no irony, there's no horror, there's no awe. It's the pure impersonal. And it raises an interesting question for us, that if secret societies are about speaking the unspeakable often, like that's their goal, the question is whether or not the impersonal is the only correct tone to enunciate the unspeakable. That's something that we'll look to. And that might be why a lot of times in shamanic traditions, you have to go into a trance in order to speak the tongues, because it's the entrance into the impersonal. All right. The last thing to know about him, so it steals his bloodline, kills his kids. He becomes cold, almost like an autopsy report is how it sounds to read these 900 pages. But the last thing to know is that Ibn Hajar himself had contracted the plague, but survived. Now that adds a weird complication on top of it. He's a plague survivor. That's very rare, by the way. That's very difficult to pull off. That's like 5% of people just spontaneously survive the plague without any cures or anything like that. And that, instead of making what most survivors, he doesn't have either survivor's guilt, nor does he have survivor's rapture. Instead, he becomes something like the undead. His writing is the voice of someone who should have died, who's pretty much dead already, but just living in some zombified bonus round of an aftermath, right? And almost sort of purgatory in the way he describes himself. So anyway, lots of stuff like that. We could continue, and I might continue later in the semester teaching you, because then you go almost 800 years later, and you have a figure like Jalal Tawfiq writing on vampires and the different ways that vampires move. In particularly, you have the Book of Sleep by Haytham al-Wardani, which I've read with some of you in before, in Egypt. Again, really interesting placement of these things, because if you know anything about what's going on in 2013, you're in the midst of the Arab Spring in the Middle East. And he's in Egypt, of all places, Tahrir Square. Who sits down and says, I'm going to write a book of sleep that traces insomnia, traces sleepwalkers? It's an amazing gesture. A lot of people don't know that George Bataille's book, Inner Experience, which is probably my favorite work of his, it's absolutely stunning. Inner Experience was composed while Nazis were invading Paris and bombing Paris. So it's written right in the bowels of World War II and the burning of his city. And he says, I'm going to write a book about ecstasy and supplication and the impossible and unbelievable. We could get into Frankenstein mythologies, because there's not just one book on Frankenstein. You can find others, like Frankenstein in Baghdad, which is really cool. And the Book of Poisons. I'll get into this later. These are all forms of secret societies that are based on these things, and based on particularly books that are written by authors who are suspect. So what I want to do at this point is transition into a kind of workshop mode, where if we are, let's say, the 30 of us here or so, if we are the architects of a mystery cult or a secret society, and by the way, I didn't give you the history of Mediterranean mystery cults because they'll be intuitive as we develop them. The Eleusinian ones, first of all, it's really important to have a space, you know, whether it's a temple or it's an underground or something like that. It's essential to have initiation rites. This is almost universal to all mystery cults and secret societies. They have their own uniforms, right? They have their own, again, objects, sacred objects. They have their own texts. These are things that we'll talk about. But actually, I want to get into really pivotal minor decisions and descriptive decisions. So let's start with space and let's contemplate. I want to free it to you and say, let me ask, so that you don't feel like you're just totally on the spot. If we were to build our secret society on an island, what is the immediate consequence? And there are multiple answers, no right or wrong to this, but what are the immediate consequences of deciding that our secret society is based on an island? The geography, the topography, anything.
No, it's secluded.
Excellent. Seclusion. Perfect. You want to keep going with that?
So you get control what goes in, goes out, and
Excellent.
people move in the space where they're lodged.
Exit. It's a question of access, question of entrance and exit. You can deprive people from leaving. You can monitor who comes to the island. It creates a physical sense of separation from the rest of the world, which is a huge perceptual trick that cults have to conjure in initiates. They have to think that they are outside the world or in a corner that is sort of broken from the world, right? Even if you, I don't want to get into this necessarily, but even if you look at Charles Manson and you look at figures like that who had charismatic sort of cult societies, they went on ranches, they go into compounds, you know, they go to sort of the outskirts a lot of the times. In Japan, where that's not a possibility, they go to abandoned amusement parks. That's the Om cult in Tokyo, you know, so, or Suicide Forest. You know, there are all sorts of places where you can decide. So, excellent. And this is the best part, is that, Isabel, from what you said, the only way to access the island is by boat. So someone has to take a journey, a literal journey by boat. Some of you may or may not know this. A lot of you are visual artists. There's a Croatian theater director. He's been in a few movies, many movies as well. He's a film actor as well, but really his love is theater. And he has a kind of improvisational avant-garde theater group on an island in the Mediterranean off of Croatia. And you have to take a boat to go to the island and watch the play that evening. Now, what's interesting about it is that the amphitheater is actually based on an old communist prison that has been abandoned since the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. So you're in a prison island. This is where traitors to the state were taken and tortured or executed or imprisoned for years, you know, on this sort of beautiful island. That's a weird paradox too. And they've leveled it so that you sit in this pit and you watch the plays. Another interesting thing is, do you know who funds this experimental theater group? Angelina Jolie. Go figure. Just some trivia for you to know. And that's going to take it. The reason I bring that up is nothing is just irrelevant. Who are the patrons of secret societies is an interesting question, right? Oftentimes they are sponsored, and it's different than who funds art galleries or who funds the academy or who funds governments. Because oftentimes you're back in the realm of one person who remains anonymous, who is providing sort of the financial resources to create an entire world. And some of you have seen like Eyes Wide Shut by Kubrick too. Some of these sort of aristocratic sort of cults and all of that. There is an interesting question of who's behind the scenes in that regard. All right, so we have the island. How about a cave? The sleep caves of Velia were a place for mystery cults in Rome, just so you know. So what happens if we decide to build it in a cave system? Go ahead, Peggy. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
maybe you don't have the normal light or the normal atmosphere that you would have. So it puts you in an altered reality, or the possibility of thinking about an altered reality.
Brilliant, exactly. So all of you know the allegory of the cave by Plato, right? There's a reason why he wants to demonize and vilify and degrade the cave experience as anti-truth, as anti-enlightenment, anti-reason, right? It's because you're dealing with shadow plays, you're dealing with flickers of light, partial glimpses, sort of instead of full revelations, right? Instead of the sun. So that's one definite. Who's that? Oh, so that's one possibility. That's one major aspect. And then you need to fabricate, this is where Peggy was going, technologies then to supplement the problems of the cave system. So if it's too dark down there, you need lanterns, the invention of lanterns or torches, right? So you need to bring some type of artifice there to contend with it. Okay? What else about the cave?
I was thinking of the single exit of the cave.
Excellent. The mouth of the cave. You've got a single exit to it. Great. Great. Who else, by the way, Saj, can get in through that exit typically in caves?
Marauders.
That's right. Marauders could get in, so it's easy to be cornered there. It's also, you can have predatory animals who like caves as well. You're competing with species, other species for caves, right? That's always part of fairy tale folklore when you find a cave, is that what's in the cave? Are there bats, bears, you know, sort of other types of creatures that might exist there? Peggy, you have more for us?
Yeah, so-
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just one last thing on the cave. So I was thinking of the year of Dionysius, which was this jail, and it sort of worked in the way that a panopticon works. Like, prisoners would be brought there, and the cave was so deep that you would hear echoes of the wails of prisoners inside. So it creates that kind of ominous aura to the world outside as well.
You unlocked through the Dionysian thing, you unlocked another element of it, which is the echo, the sonic dimension of caves. And what happens when the leader of your sect is reciting prayers and they're echoing and reverberating all throughout? Some of you have been maybe to sacred architectural places where you can hear someone's voice on the other side of the room. There are some cathedrals that are built this way. There are a lot of mosques that are built this way, where you whisper something on one side of the room and it reverberates to the other and all of that. And there's kind of a magical transportational element of that conduit. So definitely there's a sonic dimension, an acoustic dimension, which is essential down there. Peggy, what did you want to say about the cave?
A lot of caves are not only dark, but they're connected to other things underground. So you don't know that there isn't another way to travel. So you have that whole metaphor of the labyrinth, depending on the cave that you decide to be in.
And guerrilla societies throughout history, guerrilla warfare has made use of underground cave systems, because what you get are networks, like you said, of tunnels and all of that. So definitely, and this is, by the way, has been discovered, in case you guys don't know, increasingly in ancient Egypt in the pyramids, that they keep on excavating, they go subterranean, and they keep excavating chambers. And they find that the pyramid, the dominant post-surface, above surface structure, is not the whole story. And they just found the tomb of Osiris. Now, this is really interesting. Just last year, they found the tomb of Osiris. Why is that weird? Because the sorcerers of Pharaoh used to have rituals for the dead god, Osiris. Why would you have a tomb to a god? God is dead thousands of years before Nietzsche came up with it. Right? And they actually had mourning songs and resurrection songs to resurrect the dead god. Right? Fascinating stuff. So yes, there are networks, there are tunnels, it's all that interconnecting, and it brings up possibilities. Pradeep, what did you want to say about cave?
Yeah, I was thinking something in terms of, contrary to the allegory of cave, where one gets into an illusion or some sort of labyrinth where one is lost and so on. There's also a possibility of disillusionment, of enlightenment, cave on top of a mountain, where suppose Zarathustra was, or where even Muhammad was. So
Mhm.
there is also that aspect of cave where, in terms of a radical solitude from the world, gives way to something else. And I think that's the secrecy that leads to transmutation in some sense, where it becomes the philosopher's stone of changing suffering into something higher.
Excellent. You know, there's something else pretty good based on what you just said there. Plato willfully or ahistorically fails to acknowledge something, which is that in ancient caves, which are part of the originary architecture of, sort of savage times or primal times, you find cave paintings. Right? Now, remember, Plato hates painting, right? He hates most forms of art and most forms of mimicry and mimesis, right? As imitations of the perfect form of the real and and all that. So I don't think that would save him from hating. He would hate caves even more if he knew that caves were full of paintings, right? But it is an interesting question just historically too, why these first peoples who were first transitioning into what we can call human consciousness or whatever, from their animality, or carrying it over or interlacing it, however you want to look at that, that moment. Why, when everything in that time is fragilely hanging in the balance of survival, so resources are absolutely essential and time is essential. Every half an hour that you spend is a half an hour you could starve, unless you're looking for food, right? Or protection or something. Why would they waste time on art? And I say that not mockingly to art. I'm saying it's kind of awesome. This is a complete luxury exercise. And by the way, these cave paintings exist before the exercise of money, and before the invention of money, before the invention of cities, before the invention of language, maybe even necessarily, communicative language. So this is kind of awesome to waste resources, because those are actually their oils, their dyes, their brushes, their things that they could be using for other things, right? And time to create these images. It's a stunning question of that function, and what goes on there in those paintings, and how do those paintings aesthetically differ from the other history of paintings that are not subterranean, that we see in Renaissances and in ancient sculptures and in Jackson Pollock and Impressionism and things like that, right? So that's a question that still remains to be seen. And by the way, there are even some scholars who have tied those ancient cave paintings to graffiti culture, of today, and saying that there's an interesting resonance, that we think of graffiti as this like punk innovation of the late 20th century, and actually that's the most ancient art form in a certain way. And if you look at the hieroglyphs and things like that. But there's also one other thing just to mention, which is, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but caves have also different climates of ventilation, and they often are spaces of hypoxia, meaning that not enough oxygen gets to the brain, which leads to all kinds of visionary altered states as well, potentially. So that's just cave stuff. Any other cave stuff real quick? Miki, did you want to say something quickly about caves?
Yeah.
Sorry, we have Sarush and Arnav.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Steps.
Why don't you choose then? I'm just going on who I see.
Sarush, am I pronouncing your name right?
Very conceptual. I guess at some point we can also talk about the forest. In Gothic literature, it gets this kind of like a very weird place where you're actually experiencing some hallucinations. Also, the cave reminds me of the Asphalt Cap, if you know, and the way they did like a time travel with the sleeping, and they again they wake up in like 300 years, and then use it as a device to time travel, and at the same time this seems like a subversive sect aura or association, which maybe they have like a hyperspace inside and outside of reality at the same time, which also reminds us again of how at the beginning of Plato's Republic, people were gathered at the Palace are actually some kind of renegades who are outside the city. And again, this is a cave inside a cave, maybe something like that.
Very cool. And I love what you brought up with time there, because caves are primordial, which means they're not in this civilizational time, the chronology of civilizational time. So if we were to go to ruins, we could place them in history, right? We could say these are ancient ruins of a certain society, civilization. But caves are kind of a space of eternality, right? That's why the Prophet Muhammad goes up into a cave, right? It's the eternal time, sort of time space, which leads to different things. And what's interesting there is that there's a third option, which happens in secret societies sometimes, that you don't really want the ancient or the medieval, you want the hypothetical time. So this is crucial because if you guys look at Game of Thrones, what the hell time period is Game of Thrones? It's an amalgamation. It's a very postmodern amalgamation that would make no sense in any other generational culture, because it's got ancient motifs, it's got gladiator culture with dragons, those are ancient, with medieval motifs, knights and kingdoms and things like that, right? With magical motifs, right? So there's all kinds of stuff that doesn't make sense. It's a kind of just whirlpool of different eras and periods and all of that. And in our 2024, we're okay with the dissolution of those temporal boundaries. But the cave is not just, it's not ancient, actually. It's just, it's a kind of immemorial structure that allows you to project a hypothetical time, the world that could have been, you know, an epocality that might have happened, right? And that's a very, by the way, dangerous, slippery slope. I don't want to go on this, off this deep end, but you can look at certain extremist movements like ISIS, for instance, that are motivated by the notion of a trajectory that was interrupted or deviated. So the whole narrative of ISIS is that back in a certain century, things went crooked in the Islamic tradition, became imperfected, corrupted, stained, contaminated by imposters, and that we've been on a kind of runaway train of pretenders and decadence ever since. So what is ISIS's dream? ISIS's dream is a time travel back to not the moment of the bifurcation, but to the dream of the lost utopia, the failed golden age that would have resulted if not for all the scapegoats who tampered with the line. Do you follow? So that motivates vengeance and at the same time a kind of ecstatic reveling in a mythology that you can keep on improvising and embellishing and enhancing because it's fictive. It's, you know, it's a complete speculative gesture. And the weird thing is that even stronger at some levels than traditional fundamentalism? Yes. That theater of the mind? Yes. Because the operational flexibility of it and also the sensations associated with hypothetical, imaginary times is actually, I think, a stronger strand of fanaticism than people who believe in something that did occur. I know that someone that actually walked the earth, having to avenge the world on behalf of the one who never walked the earth, that takes you into strange compartments, right? Arnav, what did you want to say, please?
Jason, you mentioned about different times in the cave that leads to different temporalities. I couldn't help thinking of the cave as a space of heterotopia, but also includes heterochronia. So
Yes.
And apart from that, also its associations with the unconscious, the individual and the collective, that basically in many myths you meet your doppelganger or double your and it's part of your quest for individuation that you and I think many authors in the turn of the century Europe has written on this, like Gustav Meyrink, and that you his Der Golem, I think, that you go down into the caves, into the underworld, and then you meet your mythic double, and then you come up like transformed and individuated.
This is wonderful. You know, there is a horror dimension to that psychoanalytic principle of the double. What happens if you meet the double and the double doesn't want to meet you, or the double hates you, or the double has been conspiring against you in the shadows of your repression? So there's that idea. And even Lacan speculates that if the double ever did come back to the surface, it would want to kill you. It would return as a pure death wish. And that's his reading of Frankenstein. You know, and so it's a really interesting question, because you're literally surrounded by shadows sort of down there. And the shadow is Jung's, also his image for the individuated, you know, sort of unconscious sort of our, you know, of our identity and all of that. So he would, I mean, it's quite literally the world of shadows in the cave. And so what happens when you start talking with that shadow? What happens when you start communicating with that shadow? What happens when you allow that shadow to have a stake in your consciousness or motivate your actions? You know, is it similar or dissimilar to the voices in the head of the schizophrenic, you know, who influence and who mobilize, but who increasingly become aggressive and violent over time? You know, that's an interesting question also, whether this would get me in big trouble in certain places in the Middle East, but there is a way of reading the chapters of the Quran. They get shorter, the verses get shorter as you read them. That doesn't mean they were revealed in that particular sequence. That could have been a stylistic sort of choice or selection after the fact. But assuming that they were actually revealed in that order, in that sequence, why are they more aphoristic and shorter and shorter and shorter? It's because the voice in the cave is getting louder and more unbearable, right? More intimidating, more overwhelming, more excessive, to the point that the prophet can only retain 3 sentences or 4 sentences at a time now, instead of long 40-page verses that he could before, right? And that actually does mirror the experience of the voices of the schizophrenic, the auditory hallucinations of schizophrenic. And it would be interesting whether or not Jung's sort of the, you know, sort of shadow world also would follow that. Would it become more diabolical, more sinister? I mean, you guys have seen even films like, what is it, Kubrick's The Shining, where Jack Nicholson's character, the more he hears the voices, the more the voices start to tell him to do cruel things or destructive things. And so this becomes an interesting question, whether our caves would also go in that direction, if we would find them going in that direction. And then the other question is then, if we chose somewhere wide and open, like a field or a valley, would that have the alternative? Would we become more hippies, sort of more about compassion and love and forgiveness and peace and principles like that then, because of the radical openness of the space? Not necessarily in either direction, but it'd be interesting to track that. Great job, Aaron. Okay, do you want to, I'm sure you want to pick
Mickey?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Mickey?
Oh yeah, well, if we were in the cave doing this secret society, there'd be the question of the airlessness of the space. So there's this degree of trust required to lower yourself into the cave and to, you know, trust how deep it's going to go and how much breathability there's going to be there. And about your point about the wide open space, I think that, you know, maybe not necessarily people would become more open, but they might be more fearful, you know, because there's this sense of hyper visibility. Like you can look out onto the horizon and you can see every figure that's there. Coming from like the Pacific Northwest, I find we're so used to having mountains and trees around us, but when I go out into the desert, I feel very kind of like on edge, because you're not used to that sense of there being no visual coverage, you know?
No, this is a great point. You know, if we followed the stereotype that then things would become more universal and more collectivist, sort of, and less diabolical in an open space. This is why music festivals are in open fields and open spaces. This is why you get like the culture of Burning Man and Coachella and things like that happening in wide open spaces, because it's supposed to be this communal kind of, resonance that is attained. But then I would also note that if you watch the film Midsummer, you get some of the most sort of disturbing typologies of collective behavior also occurring in wide open spaces, of fields and meadows and kind of mountain clearances and all that. So it must be a question of the technique of how you spin the space, how you orchestrate the space as well, how you design the space. And I love the idea of what you talked about, because we hadn't thought about this, that a lot of caves are drops. You have to drop into them, like you said, right? So there's the element of gravity. So if the island requires you to take a journey on the boat, this having to be suspended into a rope, sort of by a rope into into an open ravine or an open chasm, is also an amazing thing. No, that's great. I guess we have more stuff on caves. I'd like to move actually, because we could do this forever, and I want you to keep doing this. Is what we're going to be doing in the coming weeks. I mean, we could talk about towers, also as as a possible space. What if we put our secret society at the top of a tower? And some of you may have been to places in sort of from medieval Europe where you have to climb a ton of stairs to get to the top room. And that's often where certain sessions of monastic orders would hold certain rituals, right? So why that necessity of that expenditure of energy? It's an interesting kind of thermodynamic question, even of what it asks of you. All right, so here, if you don't mind my pivoting then, what about the body? Our secret society could do lots of things with the body as well, could demand certain things, typologies of experience of the body. What could they be? How about the secret societies of Kung Fu martial arts orders?
Pablo, Michelle, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that with the body, a lot of fundamentalist sects will talk about the body as a temple, as a space that has sacred meaning, and you're supposed to obey certain laws about how to treat it or what to ingest and when, or how fasting, I think, can be something that is punitive sometimes or healthy sometimes, depending upon how, when, and how it's used.
Brilliant, Michelle. Thank you for you did it. You unlocked the two major components, which I want us to stop because they're heavy and they're important. One is the micro and macrocosmic relationship between the body and the space itself, right? So the body as temple, the body as a kind of molecular manifestation of the larger space of the sect, right? And that they're attuned somehow, that there's a kind of mirroring effect or whatever. That's absolutely essential. And secondly, now we get the fast. And fasting this is also something bizarre. You should ask yourself, but I was interested in this, by the way. Why would ancient peoples who are often on the brink of starvation, right, experiencing famine, experiencing raids of their resources, why would they willfully engage in rituals of fasting, right, which is terrifying to them, right? This is not a luxurious thing. This is something they actually have experienced involuntarily as a cataclysmic accident of nature or of circumstance. And now you're actually having ritualized fasting, ritualized starvation, right? Now, Michelle mentioned that in some instances it's punitive. It's a punishment to explain that our cruelty, our experience of cruelty in the world is because we have forsaken or ruined some paradise that existed, and this is our penalty for it, right? But it also might be a way of reconnecting or having a second shot at that. Now, this is a really interesting thing because that implication that the secret society is about a second chance, right? At something forsaken or something vanished or something lost or something abused. George Bataille says it beautifully. He says myth, he says about myth, his definition of myth. People who believe in a myth or who need a myth are the ones who believe that the world has just one last chance, which is to say a second chance, one last second chance to get it right, you know? And so you're at almost the point of exhaustion and you have one last, you know, boxers have this where they have one last throw, you know, left in their arms. They know that they're losing, they know they're about to go out, and they just flail. And is this sort of the last recourse? By the way, empires and civilizations have this as well, right? I say this quite meaningfully in the United States, right? That you see a major dominant order potentially collapsing in on itself in its last throes. One could read it that way, and making all kinds of desperate last attempts to make things great again, which sounds like sort of, you know, the cultish message of some sects, but not the ones that I'm particularly interested in. But this idea of fasting, by the way, shares an etymological root with the counterbalance to it, which is feasting. The fast and the feast, they go together. And this is also an interesting question of reversal. We don't often see this ritualized into dominant forms of ideology, but you see it in sects, this undulation principle of we're going to experience something at the extreme limit here, and then we're going to immediately reverse it. So we're going to fast for 3 weeks, and then we're going to feast for 3 weeks, right? So that's an interesting, really interesting element as well, because it also creates the concept of reward. And if we were trying to run a secret society, the 30 of you in the room here would tell me, or 40 of you in the room would tell me, look, if we're going to recruit, if we're going to expand, if we're going to bring in initiates, we need a reward system, right? And I shouldn't probably reveal this to you, but in the college where I teach, the university where I teach, my day job, my Bruce Wayne persona, right? Where I do my institutional academic thing, so I can do the Batman thing with you guys. We have a lot of adjunct professors or lecturers, so they're not actually titled as professors. They're adjunct teachers, instructors, they're instructors, they're lecturers. There's a whole wretched hierarchy to the academy because it's a bad monastic invention. And you have professors with tenure and all of that and everything like that. So we have this whole system. And it's interesting because the lecturers and the instructors and the adjuncts have recently started fighting for their rights and asking for more representation, asking for more benefits, asking for... Do you know that so this is the interesting thing, they came and they appealed to those of us who are tenured professors saying, you should support us to have more influence or authority or compensation on campus. And everybody was for that, no doubt, because they do instrumental things just like the other teachers. They teach. At the end of the day, what's the difference? Do you know what so then they got together and they realized that they had competing interests, that actually different adjuncts and instructors wanted different things necessarily. But do you know what the vast majority, their first thing that they wanted was? To healthcare, other forms of insurance, retirement plans, better hours, sabbaticals. Nope, do you know what they wanted? They wanted the title of professor. That was their first request. That intrigued me, that they didn't care about their food as much as they cared about being able to call themselves professor, which I would happily give my title to them forever for a very minimal financial compensation in that, because I'm less invested in it. But that tells you that creating reward systems in titles and things like that, this is where Scientology, by the way, and I don't want to mix things up that, that what we're looking into is Scientology and things like that, but there are overlaps. One of the big things that they provide are levels. It's numerical there. You're at level 12. This one's at level 14. This one's at level 19, right? And you have to create this intricate ladder system and system of rewards. And the old man of the mountain, Hassan al-Sabah of the Iranian assassins, he was exceptional at giving. See, this is where the Scientologists have missed it. He did not give common gifts. He gave singular gifts for the fulfillment of a mission. So if Sahej rode out and he did a killing for the old man on the mountain and he came back successfully, he wouldn't be given the higher title only and all that. He'd be given some object from the master. And the great thing is, I know what some of those objects are. I've studied it closely. You can read Farhad Daftari and other scholars who've actually tracked this. It's not like they're all so precious or amazing. They're not all made of gold and decorated and all that. It can be actually a very banal object, but because the master has given it, it has the air of wonderment to it. It's instantaneously enchanted. Right? By the way, this ability is something capitalism would love to get its hands on. Not that capitalism needs any help in selling things, but nevertheless, they have never been able to achieve this level, this status, even with their luxury items, even with limited edition things, right? That one of a kind bestowed by a master figure. And the reason why they don't do that is because capitalism has to maintain the illusion of no hierarchies. Free market, everybody can buy. You follow? And so you can't have a figure who is so dominantly revered that the fact that they touch it is what makes it valuable, right? Which is why, interestingly, even just that, I don't want to get into all this, but memorabilia sales, meaning in your generation, those of you who are younger than myself, buying the sports jersey of some famous figure, they're going way down in value. Not interested. People are not interested anymore that, someone actually touched it or that it actually belonged to this iconic athlete or something like that, or autographs. Even autographs are becoming nearly obsolete now. Very interestingly. So this is something where we're playing with intriguing things. So let's get back to the body. So we talked about fasting is one thing we can do. What else can we do with the body in a secret society? Douglas, you got something for us? If you don't mind, sorry.
Yeah. Pablo?
Yeah, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
I don't know if my mic works. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I wanted to say something regarding the body, but before that, I would love to add, because the duality of feasting and fasting is very enticing to me. And I just think that like the etymological root for family is the same one as famine, in the sense that like this was back for the Romans. So what constitutes a family would be a family is a group of people who share meals, because when they're hungry, they all go hungry together. And when they eat, they all sit down at the table and eat together. And then the person who procures the food would be like thinking about the reward system. So the reward system for the Roman soldiers was paid in salt. And so that's why they would be allowed a salary. So this salary system is somehow like a reward system, but I guess there's just one tier when you start off, because like Jason was saying, we all would need to be part of the same tier for capitalism to work. But yeah,
wow, that's awesome. That's brilliant. I didn't know those etymologies. Thank you for sharing that. That's amazing.
Yeah, for sure.
And you were going to say about the body then too. You're going to say
I was just thinking, like body. It's like, speaking about the body, I was just thinking like now it's been reversed, because I have a friend group, and I'm the only one in this friend group. I mean, I have some friend groups, but out of this one, I'm the only one who doesn't have tattoos, and so I guess it's like reverse now. So if we were to make a cult, I'm sorry guys, I've noticed some tattoos going around in the screens, but yeah, like I just think if you want to leave behind this was written the way it came to the earth.
There you go. This is written in my notes here. So decorative rituals of the body. So you have in African tribes, you have scarification, right? That takes place. You have tattoo culture, which it's interesting because despite the trendiness of tattoo culture today, the fact that it was part of very interesting subcultures, certain warrior cultures, sailor culture, biker culture, mafia culture in the case of the Yakuza in Japan, you know, so Soviet prison tattoo cultures, surfer culture to a small extent. You know, they're interesting alternative cultures that played with ideas of tattoo, and there are other forms of bodily decoration as well. You know, I mean, the whole history of cosmetology, you know, which shocked some people to know that not only was makeup something that was neither masculine nor feminine, but both, you know, and everything in between in the ancient worlds. You know, the pharaohs wore eyeliner, you know, and things like that. A lot of people don't know that plastic surgery originates with men as well. The history of plastic surgery originates with men getting nose jobs in I believe, the 19th century. So there's interesting things like that. But you can read, by the way, if you guys are intrigued, Michael Taussig is a great anthropologist, legendary anthropologist. He has a book called Beauty and the Beast, which is about the addictive plastic surgery habits of drug cartel leaders and bosses in South America and Latin America, because they have to constantly change their face in order to avoid detection by, so they have plastic surgeons on staff continually in their compounds who are constantly reshaping them. And then it becomes a kind of compulsive sort of gesture for them. So there's one that he has actually shown. You can see it visually in photographs, some guy that did like 27 faces, and they're radically distinct from one another, you know. So there's all kinds of forms of, yes, decoration. And this becomes interesting too, because you can literally decorate the body. So you can think of belly dancer culture, and you have henna, you know, sort of, you can, and that's temporary. Tattoos are more permanent. You can also, this takes us into the domain of apparel, of garments, of robes, of jewelry, of crowns, you know, of objects that are held, scepters and things of that nature. So yeah, definitely there's all of that we can do. We can get into the decorative realm. We talked about fasting and feasting. Okay, let's move on. Is there any other things that we can bring in, other physical elements?
Can I just
So
make a
go ahead.
commentary about the tattoo thing that you're talking about really fast? It's interesting that you setting, I would understand a little bit more as branding. So about creating collective identity, a little bit of in a compulsory way, and I think removing agency as well.
That's really interesting then. Yes. So, okay. So this is where it gets treacherous, because it's not, as much as I would love for the secret society to have a completely separate or antithetical history to dominant ideologies that have, you know, ravaged our world, there's always mutual contamination. Cool cults go bad when they become political, right? And political movements steal cool ideas from great subterranean cultures. So there is something very ominous when we talk about branding, the ominous parallelism to fascism's inscription of numbers, numbered tattoos, right? On the arms of its Jewish captives, right? So we know that, you know, in the concentration camps, this was one of the, and there's a whole complex philosophy of dehumanization, of, you know, of turning somebody into a quantified thing rather than, you know, someone in the house of being. We can get into that, and that's against their will, obviously, and that's not as a form of elevation or of initiation, but exclusion, of banishment, of murder, right? Setting someone up for murder in the same way that we do in slaughterhouse industries for animality, when we label them with numbers, right? We're readying them for the killing machine, and it is mechanistic. It's not personal because they don't possess being for us. And that's sort of the first element of a Holocaust. So if we wanted to be really careful to avoid that technology of inscription, right, then we have to think what our tattoos would do and or what our brandings would do, these insignias. And it brings us into the realm of symbology as well. Look, let me put it this way too. One of the problems with any secret society is that they have an intensity arc, meaning that they start off really provocative and fascinating and powerful and a rush of creativity and energy, and then they plateau at some point, and then they degrade. And the degradation can either come in the form of stagnation, creative stagnation, so it just becomes a boring tradition at that point and repetitive, or it can fall apart under political conflict, right? People are vying for roles and sort of stealing things as much as they can, and then it falls apart. Or it can do something really awful to itself and suicide itself out of history, in a way. And that's always been a question, because that's even a question for revolution. Revolution is a euphoric burst of energy and of possibility that then leads to often an authoritarian consolidation of power. Trotsky was even interested in the idea of permanent revolution. Why can't we sustain the openness of the revolutionary moment and just have that be a society? Can't we live in the revolutionary hour? And the answer is no. And that's why surrealism doesn't exist anymore, meaning as a movement. It dies out, it burns out. It's why the ancient cults don't exist anymore. Now you should ask me and say, but wait a minute, are there any ancient secret societies that you are aware of which still persist to this day? And I would say yes. They're very rare. They're very hard to find. I've spent decades looking for them. They do exist. And the interesting question is how they modify in order to survive, how they modulate themselves, and by necessity, in order to guarantee another era, in the way that even avant-garde movements, for all of their genius, couldn't do, right? And by the way, I've taught this in another seminar. If you look at the end of surrealism, the ending years of surrealism in Paris, it got ugly. There were trials to kick people out. It was paranoia. It was competitive. It got petty. Dali started doing ridiculous exhibitionism, sort of, in all that. Breton was having midnight excommunications. It wasn't a great ending, some tragic, wonderful ending either, right? And a bunch of them even joined, well, we don't want to talk about, joined fascism and joined up with other aspects and all that. So, or threw themselves in with Stalinism. Point is that it's very hard to figure out how our secret society will last a year and in what form. So part of this is, yes, when you play with symbols, and symbols tend to have this guarantee of forever, right? Because of the gesture of engraving, right? Just the very physics of the heaviness of cutting something into surfaces so that they remain, so that they last. Did anybody know the one avant-garde movement that made it part of their ritual to burn their own works for the next generations? Those were the futurists. If you go read Marinetti's Manifesto of Futurism, you'll see he says, the next generation will come like hungry wolves to replace us, but they won't find us in the center of the city. They'll find us in airplane hangars on the outskirts, burning our own works before they get to us, to clear our way for them. Right? So voluntary self-immolation just to guarantee another age of creativity. Right? So that's a very interesting and powerful principle that they had. But I know there are hands. Go ahead, everyone should pick at will.
Douglas. Douglas.
Yeah, Pat, I was going to go back to the initial example of martial arts you brought up, And that made me think, I mean, of the potential of the cult for kind of constructing what you might call like a war machine. And you're just kind of getting at that in the last discussion you're talking about. A funny example of that I thought it was like the TV show Amish Mafia. You know, that's not quite a mystery cult, but similar. And then I was also thinking about like yogic practices and this notion of the connection between control over the body and control over the psyche and the self, and the potential of the cult for, you know, enacting this ritual transformation of the body and the self.
Excellent. So transformative rituals, you have yoga as one possibility, sort of meditative forms of the body, but you also have, this is an interesting one that is right at the borders of, Douglas, what you were just saying. Dance is also something that has been associated with secret societies throughout history, right? And I would just note to all of you, I know I've said this before, sorry to those who've heard me repeat this, but one of the things I find absolutely fascinating is that while Marx is contemplating the 19th century, very ingeniously and powerfully contemplating world historical movements that will lead to people protesting in streets and taking sort of violent action and overthrowing society, the anarchist image, utopian image of a collective is not a riot crowd, but a masquerade. And that's the most common motif of 19th century anarchism, is the masquerade, because identity itself can transform in the masquerade. You can become someone else, you can act it, and the dance is central to masquerade culture, right? So that's something that goes hand in hand with what you said. And then, yes, war games, war and games. It's interesting. That's martial arts orders. But that's all kinds of festival cultures too. Does anybody know what the most ancient, it's not the most ancient game, but the most ancient festival game on record is? Tug of war. You know, where 5 people get on one side, 5 people on the other of a rope, and you pull and see which side can pull each other. You have to ask yourself what it means that in 2020 or whatever, a show from Korea comes on TV called Squid Game that reenacts this 7,000-year-old game of tug of war, but in a fatal way where you fall into a pit and half the people die, the losing team dies. But it's really weird why these things are why they return, or how they return, how they become unlost again to us, and who discovers them and why they click at a certain moment where people are watching it. It induces awe, right? This is not new. This is an ancient form of festival rites, but definitely war, definitely games are, and by the way, and Syed, you can talk about this because you're in the game world very well, but there even are societies who saw war as game, you know, and how does that shift the paradigm when it's not about conquest or nation, or I'm not saying it's necessarily better or worse. And in fact, in the 1980s, there was a paranoid pre-artificial intelligence movie called War Games. Anybody remember this? Matthew Broderick was in it. And he's some nerdy computer programmer back when computers were like, 300 pounds. You know, there are these huge things and all that. And he unlocks a type of intelligence that is going to play with nuclear codes and possibly create nuclear disaster across the world. And you know how he starts it? By teaching it how to play chess. So in some chess game becomes, sort of the extinction of the human race, potentially. Becomes the War Games. And the film is called War Games. I don't necessarily recommend it. I'm just a child of the 80s, so I remember it. But yeah, so we have decoration, mutilation, dance, feast, war, of course. And we don't have to get into this because in some ways it's the most self-evident. A lot of the mystery cults in the ancient Mediterranean had erotic dimensions as well, right? So the orgiastic culture or pleasure sort of cults, that's part of the Dionysian and the Bacchic movements. That's even harem culture in the Middle East. what's interesting there is that harem culture, we always envision it as some sultan who has like 500 wives, but the practical reality is that it's 99.9% of the time women with women. Just the logistics of it is that it's women living with women, intersecting with women, communicating with women, performing, doing art, dancing with women. So, and the mystery cults have interesting questions of that as well. Where you start to see it become decadent and decrepit is if you look at modernity. This is an interesting thing. Modernity not only contorts and twists belly dancing to becoming now a seductive dance of women for men, which it never was historically, but also on top of it, you start to notice that cults become increasingly sexually abusive and predatory. So you start to notice that the master of the cult, gives themselves free reign and rights to the wives of all the initiates when it's typically a patriarchal cult structure. So like Waco, Texas, and things like that. This is not in line with if that's pathological, let's also say the ancients were pathological, but that wasn't the pathology of the Bacchae. If you remember also, the Bacchae was a feminine movement. The king, if you've ever read the play by Euripides, he's watching his sister and his mother sort of in this taboo gesture around a fire and all of that. So eroticism, by the way, is a lot more than sexuality as well. It encompasses more than pure sort of physical sex. That's why Bataille writes a book called Erotism. If you guys haven't read it, it's very cool in certain ways. But he starts to get into that. And even Freud's concept of love drive is very powerful and complex because it's more about consumption than it is about anything. The heart of pleasure is consumption. So that's where eating your God in the Christian tradition, right? Drinking and eating your God, eating the body of fallen enemies in ancient war, eating their organs, things like that start to become part of it. So, okay, good. Now let's move in our last 15 minutes. So we've talked about possible spaces, islands, caves, towers, there's a million of them, forests. We've talked about bodily sort of possibilities. Let's go to objects. Just give me if we had to choose one object to be the object of worship or the object of gathering, give me an object that you think would be compelling. And then let's think about what the implication would be. You don't have to have that implication ready, but who has an object?
Yeah, so I actually have a little spin on that. I grew up almost fundamentalist Mormon, and I think that it's interesting how Mormonism takes a cult view of eschewing other cult practices. So they're like, we don't use the cross as an object. They're like, it's almost like the absence of cult practices becomes the cult practice. You're not allowed tattoos, you're not allowed to dye your hair, you're not allowed, it's almost like a extreme withdrawal from that, but it's so extreme that it's its own practice of deprivation. And so the objects that you find in Mormonism are just I don't know, I can't even think of one. And I grew up in that.
No, that's brilliant. This is brilliant because you have these limitations and prohibitions placed by strict orthodoxy. So in Islam, you're not allowed to figuratively represent humans or animals, right? So you'll never see in a mosque a human being sort of, and anti-iconography, anti-object sort of culture in religions or ideologies, the more they try to institutionalize themselves. Remember that Mormonism begins with the discovery of books, of a lost book. So there is an object right at the heart of it, right? It's the charm, this magical charm of something revealed or something uncovered. But then very quickly they have to contain the rest. So if you even look at puritanical culture, color was the enemy. They dressed in black, gray, brown. That's it, right? And anything, sort of anything. Now, you might say, yeah, they were weird back in the 1600s and 1700s in the US. Do you know that became the defining criterion of elitism to this day? What do people at the Academy Awards wear? Black tie, right? What if you go to luxury penthouse apartments in real estate in metropolises? What color schemes do you see in penthouse apartments? Earth tones. You see black, you see white, you see grays. You don't see color. Color is a sign of primitivity. Indian saris, Latino pastels. Do you follow? These are cultures, island cultures. These are people who use lots of colors. Colors are a sign of barbarism. And so they need to be extinguished from modernity. That's a whole conspiracy sort of against the colorful and against iconography then as well. You're right. And against object worlds. So there's that. But the funny thing is then, what do they replace it with? It's very intriguing because that same Mormon culture also believes that God is a literal human man who has flesh and blood on a planet, right? Not so far away. And has a height that they actually know the exact height of. So there are still, you're trying to bridge this immense, colossal distance between universality and particularity, the universal and the particular. And that has a parallel to the material and the immaterial. You want your God to be immaterial, but you also want your God to be present in certain ways. And they know that they have to create these loopholes then, whereby you can feel. Otherwise, if they honestly believed that God was infinitely present in all things, and therefore we shouldn't worship objects, there would be no church either. The church is just a magnified object.
Well, the interesting, I think the most interesting thing that I find about Mormonism is that it's a distinctly like white American religion. Like it wasn't imported from England, and it was like white people invented it here. You know what I mean? And like I think that it's very capitalistic in that way, because it's kind of teaches you to worship your deprivation to the level that you're willing and happy to give 10% of your income to the church every year. And and if you are indulging in things, then you're probably not going to have 10% of your income to donate to the church.
Which is why also interesting fact that a lot of you may not know, a disproportionate number of FBI agents are Mormon.
Yeah, and CIA agents. Yeah,
that's right. Because one, they don't drink, so they're not going to go down that bad. They're not tempted by money and things like that. But also they're fiercely nationalistic because their religion tells them that Jesus chose America.
And they speak like foreign languages because of the mission experience.
That's right. So anyway, interesting stuff that comes from all this. Very cool. All right, we got 10 minutes to come up with some objects then. Who's got another object for us? Can be any object. That's going to determine a whole sort of outlook and philosophy that we have to. For instance, if we decided clocks, if we were the cult of clocks, right? That places us in a sonic realm of ticking, right? And of the sound of gears. It places us in realms of intricacy, circularity, all kinds of things and certain relationships to time. So just showing you that just by choosing something like that, we'd have to. So who's got one for us? Go ahead, call on anybody who's got one.
Peggy? Peggy?
The Holy Grail.
Okay, grails. So interesting. Chalices, goblets, cups have been part of the mythologies of different societies. The search for the Holy Grail, obviously. And again, but even by the way, if you read Sufi mystics writing about the Prophet Muhammad, this is an interesting one. Supposedly he goes on a night journey. This was a miraculous expedition through the cosmos. It's like some type of acid trip. All the planets are melting and collapsing, and he meets all the prophets and all this stuff, and he goes on this magical horse, half human creature. The Sufi mystics really go wild with this narrative. It's called the Mi'raj, the night journey. And one of the things that happens, the first thing that happens to the prophet is he has to pass the test of cups. And God has aligned, or an angel has aligned 3 cups on a table. One with, I believe, milk, one with wine, one with honey or water. I think it's 3 cups. And I think those are the substances. And he has to choose one. And here's the amazing part. He has no precedent for understanding how to interpret this test. It's not like this is a test of something he knows priorly that he has to then live up to. He doesn't know what the right answer is. So what's he going on? Instinct, whim, divine inspiration? It's an interesting question of what guides him when you have no epistemology before. You just given 3 cups and say, choose one, right? It seems like pure luck or lottery, but it's suggested that no, there's an intuitive. That's what makes him the prophet. There's a prophetic intuition that guides him in that moment. But here's the worst part. You know what the stakes are? His 1 out of 3 is the correct cup. If he chooses one of the 2 wrong ones, his people are damned forever. He damns entire generations and races to eternal suffering if he chooses the wrong cup. That's a hell of a weird system of justice, of, you know, universal justice, if you think about it, right? So there is that, yes. And the Holy Grail, one thing to that too that I would just mention is that when you watch Indiana Jones and search for the Holy Grail and, you know, and all of that, they're on a quest. He's always competing and racing against Nazis. They're always trying to get the Holy Grail too. But that, and I've said this in many places, I've even written this, so sorry to those who've heard it, but what I find fascinating about that is what it shows is that these sacred artifacts with otherworldly powers do not care who possesses them. They bestow their powers independent of the identity of the person. Which means if a Nazi gets to Christ's Holy Grail, he'll get Christ-like powers if they get to it first. And Jesus can't do anything about it. That's the weird thing. God can't stop that. So you go back and you say, wait a minute, that's weird. So you're saying that they can't even intervene in stopping the transmission of the object's power, even though the power emanates from their lips, their blood, in the case of the spear of destiny, which was the spear that punctured Christ's, you know, rib cage, right? You're saying, so they can't even stop that from emanating forward? When you say, well, is there precedent for that in the Holy Scriptures or anywhere? You say, yeah, if you go back to the Old Testament and look at Jacob and Esau, 2 brothers, and Esau is the favored brother and is supposed to get the blessing from God, from his blind father, Isaac, supposed to get the blessing. And the father can't tell which one is which. And Jacob lies and puts, I think, sheep's wool on his arms because Esau was hairy, and comes and touches his father. So the father thinks it's the wrong brother and gives him the blessing. So now for eternity, Jacob's offspring are going to be blessed and Esau gets nothing. It's a cheat, right? A complete cheat. It's a fraud. And you should say causally God should condemn Jacob and retract the blessing. God says, I can't do it. He's got it now. That's a weird thing. Like, why can't God stop or correct the improper transmission? Why can't he give it to the rightful owner? And Esau gets that. Why doesn't he give a okay, I'll give Esau a blessing too. He says, no, there's only one blessing. And the wrong brother got it. Jacob learns from this because you know the most famous myth associated with him, wrestling the angel. Do you know what that is? He's in the desert in the middle of the night and he sees an angel wandering by. And he grabs the angel in a wrestling lock, holds it against the ground and wrestles it until morning, telling it, give me a blessing. Forcing and coercing the angel into a false blessing. And he gets it. This is a very, very strange aspect that we have to look at then in terms of force. This is why also, you guys know about fraternities stealing each other's mascots? This stupid college ritual of like, they don't do it as much anymore. But that actually comes from, you can read Zainab Bahrani, a great Iraqi archaeologist. She writes about how that's an ancient form of warfare, is stealing into the camp of your enemy and stealing their sacred objects. And the interesting thing is, just because you steal the sacred object, you would think, oh, that god idol of mine will curse them now that it's been deterritorialized and displaced and abducted. No, it transmits its blessing onto the enemy now, protects the enemy, because that's its function. So that's an amazing thing in an age where we are obsessed with identity. because that obsolesces the idea of identity completely. It's a concept of power which has nothing to do with identity, right? And by the way, it is built in the technicalities. You know that you can be, presumably, theoretically, don't get mad at me, anybody in the room who's really into the Christian doctrine, but presumably you can be a horrendous individual with decades worth of crimes and sins. And if you just ask for repentance on your deathbed and utter the right last words, now, yes, there's a modification. They should be sincere. But nevertheless, that gains you entrance into paradise. It erases and washes away. So this is interesting about how certain words, certain objects can have that really drastic effect, independent of who wields them or who holds them. And this is, of course, you have this in Lord of the Rings. You find this in fairy tales more than anything, right? Where the ring doesn't, anybody who holds the ring gets the power, right? And the quest for, and ultimately, what do? They destroy the rings, because the idea that there's a right wearer of the ring is actually wrong. It's improperly conceived. It's a delusion that there is a right wearer. So good. And actually, this is also an interesting thing about identity. Are there situations where the object overrides the human identity and turns them into something else? We have this in superhero culture, right? Where a suit can transform you into somebody else with a completely different way of thinking and behaving. But yes, this is the case as well in secret societies, that when you have, just like the ring, when you put the ring on, it changes who you are, right? And that's very interesting for us to explore. Does anybody have a final object that they would want to offer?
Swati, since you haven't spoken.
Hi. Yes, really quickly. I know we spoke about immateriality already, but there's this temple called Chidambaram in South India, and it doesn't have any idol in its chamber. And also the worship of light in Quaker communities. So maybe if you could talk about
Well,
that.
this is brilliant, because you're taking us into, then there are secret societies that want to have all the benefits of materiality, but none of the gravity of it long term. So what about societies that use vapors, for instance, smoke, right? This is why there's incense or vapors. Even in the oracles in the ancient Greek world, there were always these vaporous things that would be emitted, but then they would dissipate, they would vanish. And that gives you the momentary sort of saturating presence of an object world, but without being embedded in it necessarily long term. And that's a very different thing. But I would also note that when you mention, so it's very, very fascinating, when you mention that you have a temple and an altar that doesn't have an idol, but you still have probably the altar for an absent idol. And that actually is also in Islamic architecture, where God is the unseen. And so if you look at a mosque, unlike a cathedral, unlike Christian architecture, where you have tons of statues in the center or symbols in the center, in a mosque, you have an empty center, a vacant center, because that's the space of God. And so how do you represent the emptiness? Well, either nobody goes there, nobody occupies the center, or you put a fountain with water, because water can represent divine. Or you have a hole. I've even seen a hole sometimes, which is interesting. Or you have an altar with nothing on it. And that's really, really interesting. I love that idea, because it's, again, finding circuitous ways to steal the force of an idea without necessarily getting trapped by it. You know what I mean? And cornered by it. So there's a lot there. Wonderful. So what are we doing? Thank you, everybody. This has been great. we're at our time, right? Akanksha, I think we're at our
Yeah.
time.
Yeah,
So
we're at
let me
time.
leave you with this. Now everything falls on your shoulders. So for next week, we begin your first expedition. I'm sending all of you to the corners of the earth to find the most intriguing, the most obscure, the most rare, the most bewildering secret societies that you can find. You can, again, define a sect however you want. It can be artistic, it can be ritualistic, it can be spiritual, it can be object-based, it can be game-based, it can be whatever, an activity of a certain kind. Just find me a faction of people who are engaged in something highly rarefied and different than the everyday, and who therefore generate different forms of gathering and thinking about it and all of that. They can be actual secret societies, though, from history. That would be a good place to start. Historical secret society. Don't invent your own. You trust me, you'll invent it in the form of analysis. But go back and read as many details as you can. Come ready to present next week and describe. Everybody should just be prepared to present for 2 to 3 minutes. Okay, it's just a snapshot. It's a quick glimpse where you say, okay, I found this secret society from the 13th century, and give us a general description for only about 30 seconds to a minute. And then I want you to focus on next week. We're going to start with the first rank, which is the initiate. Okay, so after you discuss its spaces, its objects, its settings, some of its belief systems, talk about the process of the initiate. Right? So how do they enter? What are the rites of initiation? What are the consequences of initiation? And really analyze and focus on that dimension, because we're working our way up the ladder to the mystic, to the master at the end. But we start with the initiate. Okay? So everybody come ready with one example for next week, and we'll just go around the room and we'll see what emerges. Thank you, everybody. The blast.
Sorry, just a quick note that I'll send details of the folder where you can upload your final presentations by the end of the day today, so you can follow that. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jason.
What you said that the last part of the internet connection is not very good. I didn't catch what you said, the last thing you said.
Sorry, I just said that I'll send in details of where you have to upload the document for next week, your research, via email by the end of the day today.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you. No problem. Okay, bye, everyone.
Oh, I wanted to say sorry I was late. I had an internet issue.
That's all right.
It won't
That's
happen
all
again. Yeah, thank you.
Don't worry about it. Thank you.